Let's start with biological trait theories. This focuses on the association between biological makeup, environmental conditions, and antisocial behavior. People who exhibit abnormal biological traits have difficulty adjusting socially, as a result, making social relationships challenging, and thus they're more vulnerable to crime-producing stimulus in the environment. And there are three sub-areas of this theory that's used to explain the suggestion: biochemical factors, neurological functions, and genetic history. So let's start with the biochemical conditions. This is the suspected relationship between antisocial behavior and biochemical makeup as the concern. There are a number of factors. A mother who uses drugs or alcohol during pregnancy can cause prenatal damage, and later antisocial behavior in adolescence and then on to adulthood. Environmental contaminants affect biochemical makeup, especially at high levels of air pollution affecting cognitive functioning, hydrocarbon, chlorine, and nitrogen dioxide. They can cause severe defects or illness, and in some instances, even death. Lead exposure, that's linked to emotional and behavioral disorders. Lead ingestion, when it's eaten, may be a direct cause of antisocial behavior. Delinquents have been found to have higher levels of bone lead than children in the general population. Lead exposure has been linked to mental illness and schizophrenia. Another condition affecting biochemistry in the body: diet and sugar. This may influence one's behavior through its impact on the body. Maintaining a healthy diet can provide levels of minerals and chemicals needed for normal brain functioning and growth, especially in children. An improper diet can cause chemical and mineral imbalance and can lead to cognitive and learning deficits and problems. And these factors, in turn, are associated with antisocial behavior. And research shows an oversupply or an undersupply of certain chemicals and minerals, for instance, caffeine, sodium, mercury, potassium, calcium, iron, amino acids. They can lead to depression, hyperactivity, cognitive problems, memory loss, ADHD, and eliminating harmful substances or introducing beneficial ones into a child's diet can reduce the threat of antisocial behavior early on. People whose diet lacks sufficient polyunsaturated fats, minerals, and vitamins, and or contain too much saturated fat or sugar and a range of foods and agricultural chemicals, they're at a higher risk of developing psychological disturbances such as schizophrenia. And there was a case, Daniel James White, in the mid-'80s, who was an American politician who assassinated the San Francisco Mayor George Moscone and his supervisor Harvey Milk. That was on the footsteps of City Hall. The defense that was raised on his behalf is that his behavior was precipitated by an addiction to sugar-laden foods. And this struck a controversy. It was a very big verdict, a controversial verdict, that led to the coining of the legal term, the Twinkie Defense, because he was ultimately, while he was charged with murder, he was ultimately convicted of a lesser offense of manslaughter rather than the murder in the deaths of Milk and Moscone. And that's a big deal, because what had to happen, diet, sugar intake, the claim is that it has effect on behavior. What had to happen in this case is that the defendant needed an expert criminologist to enter the courtroom and make that connection, that it was this food that caused something in his brain chemistry that caused him to commit this crime. Had to say that, had to back it up, and had to convince a jury in order for that to ultimately result to charge for murder to manslaughter. So efforts to prevent crime and delinquency have focused almost exclusively on psychological and socioeconomical factors. Criminologists have largely ignored disturbed biochemical functioning as a possible cause of criminal behavior. Like alcohol and drugs, ordinary foods or the lack of them can alter the mind and unleash criminal behavior. Sugar starvation, vitamin deficiency, lead pollution, food additives, and food allergies can convert a normal brain into a criminal mind, according to some criminologists. Numerous case histories illustrate the link between diet and such behavior problems as hyperactivity in children. Recent prison experiences have shown that dietary change or nutrition educational programs have successfully reduced disciplinary problems and improved morale in prisons. Studies of alcohol abusers and heroin addicts have shown a connection between poor eating habits and psychological problems. Diets of substance abusers, hyperactive children, and others are characterized by high intake of sugar, processed and refined foods, and junk foods. Exercise has also been shown to improve mental attitudes and behavior. Light, getting vitamin D, the sun, affects nutrition and behavior. Thus, a substantial body of evidence has indicated that diet, toxic metals, food additives, insufficient nutrients, food allergies, lack of exercise, and malillumination can all contribute to criminal behavior. And evidence is mounting that a good diet makes a positive difference when working with some offenders. So sugar, food, sugar intake and diet. Hypoglycemia. This affects low blood sugar. And it could cause aggressive behavior. There was a British study that said that produced too much insulin in the blood or by near starvation diets was said to reduce the mind's capacity to reason effectively or to judge the long-term consequences of behavior. As a matter of fact, I raised this defense in a case a couple years back. A man who has diabetes was having an episode as the result. It was at the local county fair, so he was in public, and as a result of having low blood sugar, and he needed to get food in his body, but he wasn't acting all with it. And so the law enforcement agent who was there thought he was just somebody who was disturbed and tried to diffuse the situation and wasn't particularly listening to the individual's wife who was there trying to say, we need to get him to the hospital, low blood sugar. And the poor man acted out and ended up striking the officer. And guess what happens when you strike an officer? You get arrested. So first they brought him, then they hit him because he hit them. So he comes to court and he's got a black eye and he's all beat up. And I'm like, what happened? And he couldn't stand in court, and no one seemed to particularly care about that. So we got him to the hospital, and sure enough, that's what was going on, and I was able to get medical information to pass that along to the district attorney's office about what went down. So yeah, in this instance, it was used as a defense, didn't have to be used as a defense at trial, because it didn't make it that far, because I had the information that showed otherwise, and it was just an inappropriate situation. And I don't want to say it was elevated by law enforcement, but it was elevated by law enforcement. But nonetheless, it can be used, and these things cause people to behave in a certain way. Hormonal levels are factors that are associated with or can lead to antisocial behaviors. Adolescents experience more intense mood swings, anxiety, and restlessness than adults. Maybe some of you who are still fairly young, you maybe know. It's been a long time since I've been an adolescent, so. But that may explain why adolescents have a higher violence rates among teen males. Testosterone has been linked to criminality and violence. Research has shown that exposure to unnaturally high levels of testosterone permanently alters behavior. Girls who were unintentionally exposed to elevated amounts of testosterone during their fetal development displayed a marked long-term tendency toward aggression. On the other hand, boys who were prenatally exposed to steroids that decreased testosterone levels displayed decreased aggressiveness. So hormonal levels. The book talks about premenstrual syndrome. That's the onset of a woman's menstrual cycle that triggers excessive amounts of female sex hormones, which stimulates antisocial aggressive behavior. And that has been used in court as a defense, not particularly successful. There's actually only one successful case out of 3, I think, that this has been raised in America. That I do want to talk about it. 1991, America's first successful criminal defense based on the premenstrual syndrome. Helped a Virginia surgeon avoid a drunk driving conviction, but it also has been debatable and raised such controversy over the validity of making PMS a courtroom issue. The defendant was a woman, a 42-year-old orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Richter. She was acquitted by a federal judge. She was stopped for driving erratically while transporting her 3 children. She used abusive language and tried to kick a state trooper in the groin. That's what the officer testified to. She flunked the breathalyzer test for blood alcohol content in her system. Her lawyer called this expert gynecologist who testified that the defendant's conduct was consistent with PMS. And in a surprisingly rare legal claim, in light of the widespread public awareness of how cynical this defense is, the judge found in her favor. Some of the outcry, it's fair. Some women who advocate for women's legal issues say it's fair that PMS should be admissible in a court of law because really, for many women, there's nothing they could do to control it. On the other side, according to a psychiatrist, chairwoman of the American Psychiatric Association, this case sounds like what I'm scared of, the use of a psychiatric diagnosis to excuse inexcusable behavior. The judge drew criticism from feminists fearful that a renaissance of old myths about raging hormones could deny women high-level jobs and child custody. This decision just gives ammunition to people who want to deny women particular jobs. That's according to the chairperson of the National Women's Law Center. It reinforces the stereotypes that a lot of people have about PMS, that there is a certain time of the month when women become completely irrational and dangerous. It was used successfully. Britain and France, they benefited from the PMS claims since an English woman accused of murder was convicted of a reduced charge of manslaughter using that defense. But it hasn't really worked until this case from 1991 in the U.S. There was a couple others. 1982, the district attorney in Brooklyn opposed the PMS defense from the defendant. The claim that the defendant, Shirley Santos, she was accused of beating her 4-year-old daughter, and they were using the PMS defense, but then later she accepted a plea bargain, so didn't go any further. 1983, a federal judge in Denver rejected the PMS contentions of Jamie Irvin, who stabbed her roommate. Her argument that PMS caused her to assault 3 people with a car. That was actually Margaret Pitt in 1985. Jamie stabbed her roommate. Those were tossed out too. So population studies have shown that 40 to 60% of women report having at least a mild symptoms of PMS, generally occurring in 4 days before the menstrual cycle kicks in. But we won't spend a lot more time on PMS. I just wanted to put this out here as that this is used in a court of law, these things, these arguments, these theories that have been developed by criminologists, and in some instances they work. The other factor, the second factor in our biological trait theories, is focusing on the neurological brain and the nervous system, the structures of the nervous system and brain of criminals. The minimal brain dysfunction is what is referred to as damage to the brain itself that causes antisocial behavior, injurious to the individual's lifestyle and social adjustment. This type of damage can lead to a reduction in executive functioning. Executive functioning skills help one get things done. These skills are controlled by an area of the brain called the frontal lobe. Executive function helps a person manage time, pay attention, switch focus, plan and organize, remember details, avoid saying or doing the wrong thing, do things based on experience, multitask. When executive function isn't working as it should, behavior is less controlled, and this can affect one's ability to work or go to school, do things independently, maintain relationships. Impairment of the executive function has been associated in a range of development disorders, including ADHD, conduct disorder, autism, Tourette syndrome in delinquents. It's also has been associated with psychiatric and other medical disorders such as schizophrenia, alcoholism, brain disease, diabetes. How does it develop? Birth, brain injury, inherited, brain injuries that occur later, maybe as a result of an assault or a beating, emotional trauma, abuse. The connection between crime and neurological impairment is interesting. 20% of known offenders report some type of traumatic brain injury and suffer a number of antisocial traits throughout their life. And I've certainly seen this time and time again with my clients. There's usually some connection with a TBI. ADHD, despite the origin of ADHD being unknown, has been linked to antisocial behavior. ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is a condition in which a child shows a developmentally inappropriate distractibility, impulsivity, hyperactivity, and lack of attention. So how does this behavior influence crime? One view, there's two views. There's the direct view. Hyperactive kids are just delinquent prone. And the second view is indirect. Hyperactive kids don't do well in school, and educational failure is linked to delinquency, which then leads to long-term criminal conduct. A series of research studies now link ADHD to the onset and sustenance of a career criminal. Children with ADHD are more likely than non-ADHD youths to use illicit drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, be physically aggressive, and engage in sex offenses. They're also more likely to be arrested, charged with a felony, and have multiple arrests. Learning disabilities. Folks with learning disabilities are arrested and incarcerated far more greater than children who don't have learning disabilities. And there's two views that link disabilities and to delinquency and then ultimately crime. The susceptibility rationale, the side effects of the disability, right? It's the result of the side effects of the disability, the impulsiveness, the inability to take social cues that causes an individual to commit a delinquent act or to commit a crime. And then the other one is school failure rationale. The frustration caused by poor performance leads to negative self-image and thus delinquent behavior, and then acting out and then continuing on as a career criminal. Brain chemistry, abnormal levels in one's neurotransmitters, such as dopamine or serotonin, for example, can influence or activate brain functions. In turn, can be associated with aggression, Serotonin is that chemical that helps regulate mood and social behavior. Dopamine plays a role in the executive function that I just talked about, motor control, arousal, motivation. And there's a number of other body-producing chemicals that, if affected, can be associated with aggression and antisocial behavior. The arousal theory. According to the arousal theory, for a variety of reasons, people's brains function differently in response to environmental stimuli. All of us seek to maintain a preferred or optimal level of arousal. Too much stimulation leaves us anxious and stressed, whereas too little makes us feel bored and weary. However, people vary in the way their brains process sensory input. Some always feel comfortable with little stimulation, whereas others require a high degree of environmental input to feel comfortable. It's this later group, the sensation seekers, looks for stimulating activities, which may include aggressive and sometimes violent behavior patterns. Although the factors that determine a person's level of arousal are not fully understood, suspected sources include brain chemistry, such as serotonin levels, and brain structure. Some people's brains have more nerve cells with receptor sites for these neurotransmitters. Another view is that people with low heart rates are more likely to commit crime because they seek stimulation to increase their arousal to normal levels. And researcher Adrienne Rain has found that antisocial children have lower resting heart rates than the general population. In one study, he found that low heart rate may produce a need for stimulation that is associated with aggressive behavior patterns. It is also associated with impulsivity, which in turn is associated with a lack of self-control and involvement in delinquent behaviors and hence later criminal activity. The last sub-area of biological trait theories we're going to cover is genetic influences. The well-known study to focus on genetic differences as an explanation for criminality involved what has been dubbed the search for the super male. There is a video on Moodle. It's very short. It's a couple minutes. You should check it out. In the 1960s and 1970s, research scientists conducted dozens of surveys in mental institutions, maximum security hospitals, and prisons across the world. They were looking for the chromosome abnormalities in chromosomes in tall, aggressive men in the hopes that they could link violent crime to a rare genetic disorder that had just been discovered, the Xyy Syndrome. Although geneticists did find high percentages of XYY men in penal institutions and high security hospitals, much of their research was later questioned. Many of these XYY men did have a history of crime, but they weren't more violent or aggressive like the researchers had initially thought. In some of the early studies, the percentages of violent crimes committed by the XYY men were actually less than the control groups they were compared to. In addition, the sample sizes of the observed groups were too small to meet the standards of any credible scientific research. Of course, news organizations, they latch onto these studies and then it's sensationalized. Many publications use the term super male to describe mass murderers and violent criminals who allegedly had the genetic defect. Today, most experts don't place any value on the research, but unfortunately, the myth of the super male with the extra Y chromosome still lives on in pop culture, and there's a lot of references to it in TVs and movies and such. So watch the video. It's pretty interesting. But studies do suggest that there is a genetic component to crime. That is, crime is inherited to some extent. That the genetic makeup is passed down from parents to children, and that genetic abnormalities are directly linked to a variety of antisocial behaviors. Research have tried to estimate the extent of genetic inheritance using several methods, including the connection to parents' deviance, the twin behavior study, and the adoption study. And that's what we're going to talk about. Parental Deviance. The study was conducted by David Farrington that suggests that there's a growing evidence that crime is intergenerational. His Cambridge youth study indicates that a significant number of delinquent youths have criminal fathers. He found that one type of parental deviance, that's what he used, bullying, may be both inter- and intragenerational, meaning bullies have children who bully others, and then those children go up and father children who are also bullies. So it works its way down the line, and that was David Farrington's study with regards to the connection between parental deviance and children's deviance. Twin studies was another area of research connecting delinquency and crime to genetics. Twin studies compared identical twins to fraternal twins. Identical twins are genetically identical, while fraternal twins are about 50% genetically alike on those genes that vary among people. It is assumed that twins, whether identical or fraternal, are exposed to the same environmental influence, like i.e. they live in the same house, they go to the same school, same parents and such, same environmental influences. So if crime is genetically inherited, we would expect that identical twins would be more similar to criminal behavior than fraternal twins. That's the theory. And most studies indicate that that was the case. Twin studies, though, they do have some problems, and most notably, evidence suggests that identical twins are more likely to spend time together and share the same friends than fraternal twins. Hence, possibly those peers could have an influence on criminal behavior that they share. These facts, rather than the identical genes, may explain their greater similarity in criminal behavior. So then there was the adoption study. It was another way to determine whether delinquency and crime is inherited, was to compare behavior of adopted children with that of the biological parents. Adoption studies also were trying to overcome the problems raised with the twin studies. And what was learned from that study, the traits of adopted children are compared to the traits of the biological parents. If a tendency to commit a crime is inherited, there should be more crime among adopted children whose biological parents are criminals than among adopted children whose biological parents are not criminals. And most data reflects that that is the case. One study showed that when neither adopted nor biological parents were criminals, 13.5 adopted boys had criminal convictions. When adopted parents were not criminals and the biological parents were, 20% of the adopted boys had criminal convictions. So there was some connection to that theory. So is crime inherited? That is a question. So those who support a gene-crime relationship maintain that antisocial behavior is roughly 50% heritable. Some calculate that the influence of genes on deviant behaviors may be as high as 85%. But researchers Burt and Simons believe, however, that the social environment plays a more critical role in shaping behavior than genes and hereditary, especially during the critical periods of childhood and adolescence. The environment, they argue, shapes biological processes and enables people to function and survive in existing social conditions. Human biological makeup helps people respond to the everyday situations and events they face in the social world, as environmental conditions change, so do the brain and the nervous system. Adverse, dangerous, and negative environments, they sculpt and change a person's brain functioning, causing them to respond to environmental events with aggression, violence, and even coercion. But when Bert and Simons called for an end to this gene-based research, they were met with a challenge from other criminologists who found fault in their assumptions and who believe that a great deal of behavior, including delinquent behavior, is shaped by inherited traits rather than learned traits. So, needless to say, this debate regarding crime being inherited, coming from the genes, it's genetic, will remain open for further research. And there is a lot of research that is being done relative to diet and its connection to crime these days. Evolutionary views, competition for scarce resources, influence and shape human species. The evolution of gender and crime, we're going to talk more about that. We've already talked about men being more aggressive and having the greater impact on the gene pool. Yeah, we'll cover gender differences a little bit more as we move on in the semester, but we will see an evolving view in this area as we move forward. Just to kind of recap, I'm not going to read through this. I'll let you guys take a look at this. This is the summary of all of the biological trait theories that we have covered, and then with the recap on the evolution of the biological trait theory and where it's headed. We will switch gears and talk about the psychological trait theory.